So what can Prime Minister Mark Carney do to get things back on track? Well, we're going to explore that a little later on in the show with our front bench. Now, though, before Premier Ford's decision to pause the ad, I did have a conversation with two experts on Canada-U.S. relations who have a lot of experience in dealing directly with the Oval Office. Frank McKenna served as Canadian ambassador to the United States from 2005 to 2006, and Brian Clow was Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He was also the lead on the Canada-U.S. file. Thank you so much for being with us today, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
Ambassador McKenna, I want to start with you on this. Take us inside the Canadian Embassy in D.C. today. What is happening there right now?
Well, I suspect it's business as usual. It's one of the largest embassies in the U.S. Because it has to manage the most complex relationships in the U.S. So visas going on, accreditation, passports, all of the things that go on every day are going on. But what I think you really want to know is what kind of consternation would there be around the trade negotiations. And I suspect that has been now moved up to the prime ministerial level. So they probably have down tools for the moment in terms of the day-to-day negotiations.
Brian, talk to me a little about the multi-pronged approach to these negotiations. I mean, Doug Ford is very much allowed to stand up for his province, but does there need to be a bit of a rethink of whether or not there's only one voice on this file coming from this side of the border?
Well, look, in my view, Doug Ford has undoubtedly hit a nerve, so maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. Remember that dogs don't bark at parked cars, so obviously he said something which really bothered the administration in the United States. But remember, Ontario is suffering huge job losses in the auto sector, in the steel sector, also in the lumber industries and other industries. People are hurting, and Premier Ford is reflecting that pain. I think it's very difficult in a federation like Canada for the Prime Minister to tell premiers that they can't speak publicly. But I do hope, and I'm sure Brian can speak to that, that there is a large element of coordination and cooperation taking place.
Yeah, Brian, what is that like in terms of trying to have that kind of coordination? You were there behind the scenes in those negotiations for CUSMA. And, you know, talk to me a little bit not only about the eruption that we're seeing from the Oval Office, and, you know, you guys certainly saw that the last time with those negotiations, but specifically on that one voice. Do we need to have a rethink of what's going on here?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges the Carney government is facing right now, and it was a big challenge that we faced when we were negotiating NAFTA the first time. How do you keep the premiers, the stakeholder community, union leaders all on the same page and focused on the one shared goal, which is coming to a good deal? There's definitely some value and merit to independent actors like the premiers speaking up from time to time. I remember in the CUSMA talks of 2018, when a premier was doing something that the Americans didn't like, sometimes that was useful to us at the table. All of that said, right now, I firmly believe there's too much. Team Canada is not acting enough like Team Canada. There does need to be a bit more coordination. Premiers firing off on their own, saying whatever they want every single day. Of course, they have a right to do it, but I think it's not helpful at the negotiating table.
And Brian, one of the issues right now is that the Prime Minister is on a plane on his way over to Asia. And we did hear from Premier Ford, who confirmed he's going to be running that Reagan ad during the World Series Game 1 tonight. So, Brian, like, how do we sort of square that circle? If everybody's supposed to be on the same page, or you're trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page, how does that happen today?
It's clearly very challenging, and there's a push and pull on working constructively and hitting back, as Premier Ford clearly likes to do. But I would say we're in a different time now than we were even earlier this year, and certainly different from the CUSMA negotiations of 2018, in that Canada retaliating and hitting back against Donald Trump on its own, it puts us in a unique situation where Trump hits us back uniquely. So I'm of the view that, you know, of course, Doug Ford had a right to do what he did with the ad. But when Donald Trump reacts by freezing the talks, I think we've got to look at options. And my own advice would be perhaps the Premier should declare victory, thank the President for drawing more eyeballs onto his ad and Ronald Reagan's words, but maybe then he, after declaring victory, stop running it.
Ambassador McKenna, it's really interesting. You're in one of these interesting positions where not only were you ambassador to the United States, you were also the Premier of New Brunswick during the first free trade agreement and the negotiations and those of NAFTA as well. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like back then with subnational leaders trying to have that sort of coordinated message with the Prime Minister, and what is that push and pull like, as Brian was talking about?
Yeah, it's a terrific parallel. And just before I get into that, I would have to mention that Premier Ford did freelance earlier in the year when he was threatening to pull electricity into the U.S., and he pulled back from that as well. So we've survived these little outbursts before. But we went through a similar situation. The country was deeply divided, and the premiers were deeply divided on free trade when we were negotiating in that 87, 88, 89 range. We used to get together constantly. Then perhaps there was a little more money, but they used to send the Challenger across the country and pick the premiers up and actually bring them to Ottawa or Toronto or someplace, and we would physically meet. But you recall how deep the divisions were. I ended up coming down on the side of the free trade agreement, and I was aligned with the government of Canada at the time and the province of Quebec. But most of my colleagues were on the other side of that, including my dear friend, the Premier of Ontario, because Ontario was very much offside. I remember one meeting where we were deeply divided, and in an effort to try and convince the premiers how important the wine industry in Ontario was, the Premier of Ontario had wine passed around the table, and we all ended up having a sip of wine, and the Premier said, if we can't save this wine industry, we're going to destroy the country. And the Premier of Quebec took a sip, and he said, David, for this, we would destroy the country. So it was one of those moments that I'll never forget. But we were divided, but we ended up getting through it. There are subnational governments. They all have a stake in this. So it's not unreasonable for them to express their perspective.
Brian, I want to sort of go back down to the Oval Office right now. In a number of his posts on social media, President Trump has continued to cite the U.S. Supreme Court, which is set to hear oral arguments on whether or not he can unilaterally impose tariffs and essentially bypass Congress. So is this really about the ad then, in your opinion?
I do. Well, first I'll say this has nothing to do with the Supreme Court case, and Donald Trump knows that. So like we often see from this president and from this administration, it's a bunch of nonsense they're putting forth there. What it is about is Donald Trump likes his tariffs. He wants unilateral concessions from Canada, and I think this is trying to pressure us to do that. So on the one hand, you know, we've got to stand up for ourselves, but as I said a moment ago, if certain actions cause the talks to break down completely, as we've seen today, I think Canada needs to adjust on that side and try to find a way to get those talks to resume.
Yeah, and Ambassador McKenna, what I thought was interesting this week as well is we had seen President Trump mention the ad and kind of say that he would have done the same thing as well. But then you contrast that with what we heard from Prime Minister Carney and Premier Ford, who were both asked about the ad. And Ford essentially said that he conceded that it's easier for him to sort of lob these shots across the border because he's not the one who's sitting across from Donald Trump. Just talk to me about whether or not you think that, you know, this was the play that should have happened, and whether or not, you know, this will sort of iron itself out eventually.
I can categorically tell you that this is not about the Supreme Court case. Trump is threatening to show up at the Supreme Court himself and sit in the front row to let the judges know what the stakes are. So it's not about that. I think it struck a nerve. And will this be the end of negotiations? No, categorically it will not. But it's not as if we walked away from some terrific deal that was on the table. We've got the most complex and the largest trading relationship in the world. And essentially, we were down to one or two of the groups that are being affected, a couple of the pain points. We didn't even really get into autos. We didn't really get into softwood lumber. And even around steel, we were talking about quotas and tariffs on top of quotas. So it wasn't as if it was a spectacular deal that we walked away from. No, there's hard slugging left to be done. We need to continue to have leverage. Mark Twain said it best when he said the art of diplomacy is saying, there, nice doggy, until you can get your hand on a big rock. And we need to get our hand on a big rock, leverage, whether it be critical minerals or potash or aluminum. We need to continue to pressure the United States by diverting a lot of our most important resources to other markets around the world.
Brian, I want to look ahead to the next week and maybe even the next couple of days, the ASEAN summit and APEC, likely where we could see Prime Minister Mark Carney have at least a pull aside or exchange a couple of words with President Donald Trump. What do you think will happen there, and what does Prime Minister Carney have to do in that interaction, in your opinion?
Well, clearly the Prime Minister and the President, they get along. There's a positive tone between the two, and that's a good thing. So I think there is a chance, and there's some hope that we can get these talks back on track through that interaction at APEC. But as we also know, and as we've seen repeatedly, tone enough and positive interactions is nowhere near enough to get us to a resolution of all these trade issues.
Ambassador McKenna, what do you think would happen, or what would you even counsel the Prime Minister to do if he does have a pull aside or even a meeting with him?
Yeah, they have a respectful relationship. I'm led to believe that Prime Minister Carney is well respected by President Trump. I think he needs to try to reset the relationship and basically agree on a couple of headlines that President Trump will be attracted to: settling steel, settling aluminum, for example, and maybe coming up with the nature of the deal. What's happening now is that we're getting down in the weeds on all kinds of detailed issues, and we really need to figure out what the big deal is, what the headline is. And we haven't been there yet. But at the end of the day, the decision maker is clearly President Trump, and President Carney will have to deal with him and try to get this back on track. But I just want to caution people into thinking this is not going to be easy. President Trump loves tariffs. He's loved them all his life. The United States has now become quite addicted to them. This is not like trying to sell a bucket of cold beer in a lumber camp. This is not an easy sale. We have to work very hard in order to get a deal that is mutually beneficial for both countries.
Brian, last word to you on that.
I would just say I fully agree with the Premier. This is not going to be easy, and Trump really likes his tariffs, so we've got some work ahead of us.
Yeah, okay. I appreciate it, gentlemen. Frank McKenna, former Canadian ambassador to the United States, and Brian Clow, who was the former deputy chief to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Thank you both for being on Power Play. We appreciate it.